Um, yes, I will try to talk for 40 minutes, 45 maximum. And I have to, first of all, I have to apologize because there will, I mean, the topic is rather specific. I will try to be as general as possible. But on the other hand, it is unavoidable to have many Sanskrit words in this presentation. I will, of course, try to make your life easy, but please bear with me. Well, I hope you will get at least something. Are there any yoga practitioners here? Just raise your hand. Okay, not bad. We'll say 1/3 of the audience, as I expected, more or less. So yeah, indeed, today the topic will be yoga traditions in Pramodern Indonesia. Well, nowadays yoga is a rather popular and sexy topic. Unfortunately, it's not the yoga in Indonesia, especially, is not very well studied. In fact, I guess not many Indonesians and also foreigners are aware that yoga was known in Indonesia, and there are several textual sources of great interest for the study, for our understanding of yoga. Now, I am a textual scholar, so I'm a philologist. I study text, Sanskrit and Old Javanese. So I'm going to focus on the text today, but again, try to be, to make some, historical considerations as well. I'm a student of religion. Basically, I study Hinduism and Buddhism in Indonesia, and I'm not only going to talk about the pre-modern period, but I will also add something about the modern period. Now, next slide, please. Great. Okay. So, what is yoga? First of all, I think everybody of you, each one of you, probably has a different idea about what yoga is. Maybe the practitioner have a certain experience. Now, yoga has become in recent years a global phenomenon, a transnational and transcultural phenomenon. There are discussions as to whether yoga is a religion or is a lifestyle, a discipline. If it is, it's still debated. Well, most of you know the yoga as gymnastics, I would say. So most of you, the practitioners among you, practice yoga at the gym or in other places as a technique to improve your health, to do some gymnastics. But probably some of you are aware that yoga is indeed has a history. Yoga is a cultural product of the Indian subcontinent, so of India. It has a very long history, and it is not just a practice, but there is also philosophy and religion. So it is a very complex phenomenon with probably around almost 2,000 years of age. And this is something about which modern practitioners, especially in the West, are not aware of this history. And I hope that more and more people will become interested also in the intellectual and theoretical aspect of yoga, on which I'm going to focus today. So as you can see in the slide, is probably yoga today is really something at the intersection between health, lifestyle, gymnastics, spirituality, and religion. Now, the modern yoga is often called postural yoga because it puts emphasis on the postures, on the asana in Sanskrit. That is the posture of the body. Many of you are familiar with the asana, the postures of yoga, and you practice this asana. But few people are aware that this postural form of yoga is, after all, a creation, a negotiation between the old tradition in India and the encounter, so between the tradition and the Western tradition. So that there is also there a history, and also rather recent. In fact, it is only in the 20th century that, let's say, certain milieu in India and in the West started to be in contact and to develop. So in India, there was more and more focus on bodily practices. Right. But the origin of the phenomenon lies in the pre-modern Indic religiosity, philosophy, and in the texts. So it's a very complex phenomenon. Next slide, please. All right. So again, about the history of yoga. Yoga is not found, at least as we understand it, in the oldest text of Hinduism, that is the Vedas, which were composed orally in around 1500 BC. But it starts to be attested in the text somewhat later, a few centuries later, in the period when so-called classical Hinduism started to be formed. More or less the period of the Buddha, of the historical Buddha, that is the 5th, 6th century BC. And then especially the 1st century of the Common Era, you have some kind of standardization of yoga. According to some scholars, yoga is indeed not a Vedic phenomenon, but it was something that was perhaps in India before the migration, so-called Aryan migration, so the migration of Sanskrit speakers from the northeast, the northwest, Central Asia, northwestern India. And it is probably like karma, like the famous doctrine of karma, which is also a constituent part of Hinduism, a doctrine of coming from a non-Sanskritic milieu. So this is interesting because perhaps, well, it means that yoga is born out of the encounter between different streams of civilization, the Sanskritic, Vedic, Aryan civilization, and the local indigenous civilization that were in India. And that, in fact, from this encounter, what we now call Hinduism probably was developed. Next slide. Right, so what does yoga mean? Yeah? So the Sanskrit term yoga is a Sanskrit word. It's from the root yuj, which in English translates more or less like unite, join, but also to apply, so application of some process. Now, there is a very important text I'm going to mention several times today, that is the Bhashya, that is the commentary on Patanjali Yoga Sutra. Perhaps some of you are already familiar with this, because the Yoga Sutra by Patanjali are really the foundational texts, are like the Bible of yoga. It's an old text, probably written in the very first 2 or 3 centuries of the Common Era. And it is considered, well, the classical manual of Sanskritic yoga, which is still today translated into many different languages in modern and contemporary editions. And so it's becoming quite popular even among yoga teachers, for example, and practitioners alike. Now, according to this text by Patanjali, yoga is to be intended in the sense of absorption. So there is a sutra, Yoga Samadhi. Samadhi translates as absorption. It's a meditative technique, right? It's just the application, kind of absorption of your mind into a higher state of consciousness, empty of the contents of the mind we have during everyday life. So according to Patanjali, yoga is more or less equivalent to samadhi. So this is one understanding, right? What is yoga? According to this foundational text, yoga is not union, but absorption rather. This is very clear in other commentaries, for example, by Bhoja, the Raja Martanda, which explains that yoga is from the root yuj and has the sense of absorption. Yuktir yoga samadhanam, yuja samadhau. So it's a grammatical explanation here. It means that yoga is not to be understood as union, but rather as absorption. This is quite important because nowadays I think it's popular knowledge that yoga means union, right? Union with God, with the deity, or whatever. And this was not actually the original understanding, so it's always good to stress this. On the other hand, it is also true that there are ancient traditions which understand precisely yoga, precisely in that sense of union. They were different traditions, theistic traditions, so the tradition which focus more on God, in fact, on the worship of a Hindu god. For example, the Shaiva teacher Narayana Kanta, in his commentary to a Tantra, the Mergenda Tantra, defines yoga as union with Shiva. Shiva is the supreme god for a stream, the Shaiva stream of Hinduism. Next slide. So, in the end, there are many yogas and understandings thereof. Important to stress, yoga did not always have focus on posture, so it's not just asana, it's not just a form of bodybuilding, but it was something more metaphysical. It was a form of meditation in the end, or even a form of ritual. So there is really a variety of understandings of this phenomenon in the tradition, in the Indian tradition. Next slide. Today I will talk about Indonesia in comparison with India, because this is what I mainly study. And Indonesia, of course, is a modern construct. Hundreds of years ago, Indonesia didn't exist as a state. There were other different polities, and I here present. I mean, I will talk about this in a wider context of what the scholar Sanskritist Sheldon Polo calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis, which is a cultural or rather transcultural phenomenon extending from Western India, in fact, Pakistan, Afghanistan, to Indonesia, to Bali, Java, and so on, where Sanskrit, the Sanskrit language, was used as a medium of elite communication, elite self-presentation, and also for scientific and religious texts. So I would like to talk about these trans-local dynamics today. Next slide. Now, Indonesia, indeed, Java. We have evidence that yoga was already known in Java already by the 8th or 9th century. I think this is a relief in the Borobudur showing an interesting pose, perhaps one particular asana, with standing on one leg. Next slide. So we are in a Buddhist context. Here we are in a Shaiva context, so Candi Shiva at Loro Jonggrang in Pramodern in central Java. It's a 9th century Shaiva temple, and you can see here a manifestation of Shiva seated, also in some kind of yoga asana. So we have visual evidence. Next slide. We also have textual evidence. For example, the oldest poetic text from Java, the Ramayana Kakawi, so the rendition, the Javanese rendition of the famous epic, Sanskrit epic Ramayana, 9th century AD, mentioned yoga several times, but with different meanings. So yoga, for example, in some instances means magic, also found next to Maya. Maya is in Sanskrit an illusion, a magic, a trick, but also as, in fact, any kind of meditative or visualization procedure. Yoga postures are mentioned too, but in a rather obscure allegorical way that is in a chapter, in 2 chapters of the text, 24 and 25th. The chapter it makes fun of ascetics, of practitioners, Hindu practitioners, practicing some strange observances, some strange, let's say, religious vows. And in this case, we have a description of the flying fox, or kaluan. It's a kind of big bat, which, these ascetics are actually presented allegorically as bats hanging down from a tree, gintungan tree. And in fact, this would seem to be a yogi practice of hanging down from the branch of a tree. Next slide. In fact, there are other verses with having the same illustration, with a clear allegorical meaning. So we have a terminology that on the one hand, the author is describing animals, but is clearly alluding to people, to men of religion practicing. And the interesting thing is that in modern Java, it's this position, which is called tapa ngalong. Tapa is from Sanskrit tapas, which means to do penance, to do some kind of religious practice. Ngalong is from the word kalong. It really means to lie, to hang down from a tree upside down. So there is a remarkable continuity. We also find this in a modern Javanese text, classical Javanese text, the Serat Pammoren Kawulagusti, written in 1802. So you see an interesting continuity there in terms of yogic postures, certainly bizarre, but nonetheless part of the understanding of yoga in Java. Next slide. We also have a modern tradition of yoga in Bali. As you know, Bali is still a predominantly Hindu island. And so there, yoga is still part of the everyday life, I would say. And it is, of course, a special Balinese localized form of yoga, which has been illustrated here by Balinese artist Gusti Mirdiana. And the most common, this represents the kind of mainstream common Balinese understanding of yoga, is really about visualization. It's about meditating and visualizing fire and water coming together in the body. So you have to assume a yoga posture, close your eyes, and meditate on certain letters, for example, of the Balinese alphabet in your body. So you see that this is also part of yoga in Indonesia. I cannot talk about it today because I want rather focus on the old period, but just for your knowledge, this is still part of contemporary Indonesian life in Bali, and obviously the continuation of an older tradition. Next slide. Now, what I would like to focus on, especially today, is this let's say, distinction, differentiation between different types of yoga. The most popular, I would say, understandings of yoga in the wider Indic world, and not only in India and Indonesia, but also in Nepal, Tibet, Cambodia, and so on. We have two varieties of yoga. This is all mentioned in the text, in the Sanskrit text. One is the Shadanga Yoga, is the yoga of the 6 ancillaries or parts. Anga is just like a limb, a bodily part. And vis-a-vis the Ashtanga Yoga, the yoga of the 8 ancillary of 8 part. The former is also known as Shaiva Yoga or Tantric Yoga, and the latter is famous as Pātañjala Yoga. That is the yoga of Patanjali that has become, it has been popularized by the text of this Indian ancient author, Patanjali. Now the former, the Shadanga Yoga, is Tarka based. That is, it's based on a more rather meditative procedure. Is a form. It's more important. It's more focusing on visualization and imagination, and indeed some kind of rational process. Whereas the Ashtanga Yoga is asana based, so it focuses on the asana. That is probably the variety that we are familiar with today. Now, I just mentioned the names of some scholars who have studied this problematic. Next slide. And now we come to the Yoga Sutra by Patanjali, which I already mentioned. Now, this text has been intensely studied in the past decade. And before it was assumed that the sutras or the sutra are just very short aphorisms. This is very, very short prose sentences in Sanskrit, which are very, very difficult to understand without the commentary. So the text is provided with a commentary, which kind of a prose commentary which clarifies the sutra, the short sutra, called popularly known as the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, that is the commentary on the Yoga Sutra. But recently some scholars have actually questioned the authorship of the commentary by Vyasa, who is a kind of mythological character. And they have discovered that the two texts constitute a single unit called the Pātañjala Yoga Shastra, probably by a single compiler. So the same author of the sutra or compiler of the sutra is also the author of the commentary. So he wrote the commentary himself, as it often happened in the Indian tradition. But I cannot explain this. Now, and then we have also many commentaries. So we have at least 4 or 5 popular commentaries written, in some cases centuries after the text was composed. On the other hand, as far as the yoga of the 6 parts is concerned, we have a very large corpus of Tantra, so this text called Tantra or Agama, of both Shaiva and Buddhist affiliations, c'est-à-dire that is Hindu or Buddhist affiliation, written between the 5th and the 12th century. And there we find the sixfold yoga, not the eightfold yoga. So we have two different textual traditions here. Next slide. And today I would like to talk about the Javanese and the Balinese texts. So that is the situation in India. And in Java too, we have a kind of a rather vast corpus of texts, of religious texts, of sacred scriptures for the Hindus and the Buddhists, written in Sanskrit, so this Indian language, with a commentary or translation or paraphrase in Old Javanese. Old Javanese is bahasa Jawa Kuno, is a language that was used, a literary language that was used in Java up to the 15th, 16th century, and in Bali, in priestly milieu up to nowadays actually, but very rare, and very few people can actually understand. So it's a literary language for the science, for the poetry, and for the religion. Now, these texts are actually reconfigurations of the corpus, the body of Hindu text in India. So this text just, took parts of this Sanskrit text and changed them, and they become new text. And most of these texts are preserved on manuscript, palm leaf manuscript, referred to as lontar, the greatest part of which survives in Bali. Still today, you can see many hundreds of thousands of such manuscripts in Bali. And some of the titles, they all have Sanskrit titles. And I actually, there are different genres, the tutur genre, the tattva genre, but we don't have to go through that today. Next slide. So just to show you some pictures here, in fact we have on the right some Balinese manuscript, on the left an South Indian manuscript. So you see it's quite similar. It's a similar tradition in terms of material culture, but also in terms of content. So here you can see this body of text called Siddhanta Tantra, the Tantra of the Shaiva Siddhanta. Shaiva Siddhanta is a mainstream form of Hindu religion focusing on the cult of Shiva. And on the right, the Balinese and Javanese tutur and tattva texts. So it's a kind of common corpus, a shared heritage, a shared textual heritage. Next slide. Now, let's see what is the sixfold yoga and the eightfold yoga. Now, the sixfold yoga is formed by 6 limbs, angas, beginning with pranayama, that is breath control, then pratyahara, withdrawal, dharana, fixation, dhyana, visualization, tarka, reasoning, samadhi, absorption. So these are the different parts of yoga. They are not really stages, I would say. I don't really understand this very much as hierarchically ordered stages, although it is true that samadhi and tarka are the highest one and also the most important ones, the final stages. So these are different practices probably leading to the aim of the practitioner. So in the ancient time, the practitioners did yoga to reach a goal. And this goal was, in this case, samadhi, that is to say, the complete emptying of the mind, the absorption of the mind into the spirit, because according to yoga philosophy, our universe arises from the meeting between spirit, purusha, and prakriti, the nature. So this was really a soteriology. This was really a method to be liberated from samsara, from the karma, because at the time Hindu believed and still believe in karma, in reincarnation, and they believed that the soul keeps transmigrating, so reincarnating. When you die, you are born again and so on, and you have to free the soul. And yoga was precisely a system of philosophy, but also a soteriology to free the soul, to achieve liberation, the ultimate goal. And these are techniques, bodily techniques, meditative techniques to achieve that goal. Now, pranayama, breath control, perhaps you are familiar, the practitioner are familiar. It's just really about regulating the breath, the inhaling, the exhaling. And the pratyahara is something that today is rarely practiced, but it involved the withdrawal of the senses, of the 5 senses from the objects. So, for example, withdraw all the senses of perception from their objects, right? So to kind of withdraw within the mind, within, as opposed of directing it without. Then the dharana, the fixation. It's often about the fixation of the sacred syllable Om, which is the ultimate sacred syllable for the Hindus, in the heart. It's really about imagining the syllable and the sound of the syllable in the heart. And then there is tarka, reasoning. It's really about some thought processes. In the case of the Shaiva Yoga, for example, when one thinks, I am Shiva, I am not different from the Lord, God, these kind of things. And then finally samadhi, that is complete absorption, the clearing of the mind becomes clear, and you have no more difference between the spirit, or rather, you actually understand that you are not the mind, you are spirit, yeah, right? You are not confined to this body and so on. This is the 6-fold yoga, and the 8-fold yoga is a bit different. There are some common parts, as you can see, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi are also there, but you don't have tarka, but on the contrary, you have 3 more angas, which are yama, niyama, and asana, postures. So the primary commandments, or moral observances, is just a set of moral behaviors. For example, not to kill, ahimsa, not to steal, and have only little food. This kind of everyday life rules. One set the yama, and another set, subsidiary set, the niyama, and then the asana. And this is really understood as stages. They are understood as stages. So you start by introducing these norms into your everyday life. Then you start practicing the postures, and then you kind of advance on the path with pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and finally also samadhi, which is the highest stage. Now this is next slide, please. Yeah, this is a table illustrating the different lists. So you can study all the texts which describe these yogas, and you can compile a list with all the differences. You can see that some texts, more tantric texts, have this 6-fold yoga with tarka there as the 5th member. And on the other hand, on the right, you see the Pātañjala Yoga, so the texts which are more influenced by the yoga of Patanjali, which have 8 members, and they have asana and not tarka. So the important thing to mention is that even the text of the 6-fold yoga, they actually mention the postures, asana and yama and niyama, but they don't consider them as integral part of the practice. So it's a kind of preparatory practice. So it is always a good idea to start with yama and niyama and also do some asana, but they are not really important. They are just a good preparation for the real practice. So there is a difference there, you see. For the Ashtanga Yoga, they are really part of the practice. For the Shadanga Yoga, not really. They are not constitutive. They are just some accessory propedeutics or something really preparing to the real practice. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Now, I will talk about this text called entitled Dharma Patanjala, which is a very interesting text, which I studied for my dissertation, and it has been published in 2011, and again this year in an Indian 2nd edition, which actually you can find. I put one copy on the table. If you want to have a look, you can. Feel free. This is an old Javanese manuscript found in Central Java in the 19th century, but coming from West Java actually, from the 15th century. written in Sundanese script. So it's a Western Javanese audience, but just to give you the idea of this kind of, rather systematic way in which the author chose certain parts of the Yoga Sutra he was interested in. Other parts he just left behind. Some parts are more important than others. So this is all like adapted to the local needs. And I will explain that anon. Next slide, please. So indeed, as is Indian scholar Dasgupta explained, while describing the Kitab Pātañjala, which is the Arabic text I was talking about, he described this text by Al-Biruni as a modification of the yoga doctrine on the basis of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, of course, on the one hand, in the direction of Vedanta and Tantra. So some kind of medieval Indic re-elaboration of Patanjali, so as to accommodate the predominant, let's say, interest or the predominant issues of the time. And in that time, Vedanta, this Indian stream of philosophy, was quite popular. So of course there was an interest in Vedanta, and the yoga was reappropriated by the Vedanta and by the Tantra. Tantra was another important medieval Indic religious stream. And again, he described it as the transition link, through which the yoga doctrine of the sutra entered into a new channel in such a way that it could be easily assimilated from there by later developments of Vedanta, Tantra, and Shaiva doctrines. And I think this also applies to the Javanese Dharma Patanjala. I believe that the texts are roughly contemporary, and they're both the expression of certain of their times, that is, of a medieval Indian religious culture, and show in fact a concern for theism, so for this focus on the worship of a single god, that is Shiva, and also different soteriologic concerns, so different ideas about what is salvation. So we have seen for Patanjali, salvation is samadhi, and samadhi for Patanjali means kaivalya, that is isolation, that is the separation of the mind and the soul, of the mind from the spirit, and from actually the spirit from the prakriti, so from the nature. So it means your soul is completely absorbed within itself. It knows itself without any external awareness. Whereas for the Shaiva stream, for example, for Tantra and for Shaiva religion, the most important goal of yoga is unity with God. That is Shivasa Atmiya, so to kind of unite your spirit or identify your spirit with God. And this is exactly, within this concept lies the difference between sixfold yoga and eightfold yoga. So you see, you have really a different understanding, as I showed in the beginning, of the root yuj as samadhi, absorption and isolation, or rather as identification and indeed union, yuj yoga, with your selected deity. Next slide. Now I would like to move to the modern period. I think I have very little time, so I will try to go a bit fast. This is a quotation from an article by a Dutch scholar on the Dharma Patanjala. He very briefly studied, he really mentioned only the text in a footnote. But he mentioned the text in an interesting way. In fact, he knows rightly that the Dharma Patanjala is the only text which has preserved the eightfold yoga and not the sixfold yoga, which was prevalent in Indonesia. So all these Shaiva texts, this Tattva and Tutur, they all have sixfold yoga because they are part of this Tantra and Shaiva developments, and so they really have this standard type of Shaiva sixfold yoga. The Dharma Patanjala has the eightfold yoga for some reason, and based on Patanjali. And Ensing also noticed that there is another case of eightfold yoga in an Indonesian text, that is Aji Sankhya. It's a book written in 1947 by a Balinese intellectual. He was a very prominent reformer, Hindu reformer. And well, for some reason, he also liked Eightfold Yoga, and he used a translation, a rather tortuous Malay translation by intermediary of a Javanese and Dutch translation of an English Wood's translation of the Yoga Sutra, which is actually, it's not totally correct, but okay, I will not enter in detail, but it's true. There are several, it's a modern edition, a modern Indian edition of the Yoga Sutra. And this was printed and translated into Dutch in the 1951. Next slide. Next slide. This is not really important. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is the cover of the book. So it was printed in a very rudimentary form. Next slide. There are even manuscripts of it. That means that those manuscripts are actually, how to say, younger than the book. So the manuscript was written on the basis of the printed book, which is quite funny, but it happens in Bali. Next slide. And this is the scheme presenting the philosophy underlying this text. This is a manual of Hinduism. So the author just wanted to present all the Shaiva philosophical principle in an easy way for the majority of the Balinese. So it is written in modern Balinese, not in Old Javanese or Malay even. And just to show you that this is a text which really is a continuation of the tradition of Shaiva texts I've been speaking about, the tutur and the tattva. So this is really like a modern recasting of the old Javanese and Balinese tradition of Hindu texts. Next slide. In fact, there is one of these tattva texts called entitled Vrihaspati Tattva, which has a very similar philosophical outline and knows sixfold yoga, not eightfold yoga. So just to tell you that indeed there is a continuity, and for some reason the author in this respect, so in respect of yoga, he chose to present Patanjali instead of following the tradition he was accustomed with, so the tradition of the Balinese tutur, of the Vrihaspati Tattva. Next slide. And this is quite interesting. Why he did so? Well, in fact, in his at the end of his book, he mentioned holy sources. So he mentioned many Balinese and Javanese texts. So he say, I have taken all these doctrines from this text. I didn't have added anything. But also, in fact, he did add something, that is the Yoga Sutra or Yoga Sutra. He really mentioned this book, the Kitab Yoga Sutra Patanjali, translated into English by Manilal Nabubhai Dwivedi in 1890, so printed in India, and printed in Surakarta in Central Java. So he got hold of this book somehow and say, well, this is like very good, this eightfold yoga, you know, I will use it rather than the sixfold yoga. Next slide. Why? Well, maybe because in those years, those years were years of reform. So Balinese Hinduism is a very old tradition, but it was also reformed in the 1950s. It's a very complex discussion about the encounter between Balinese Hinduism and Christianity, Islam, and so on. But so in those years, also the new doctrine from India started to arrive, to arrive in Bali, to be known. And the reform, so Hinduism was also reformed in India. So the work, for example, of Swami Vivekananda, Swami Shivananda, were known in Bali and taken as a models for this new, let's say, this new elaboration of Balinese Hinduism as a world religion, more similar to India. And in this case, it's interesting because this is the Javanese Kitab Yoga Sutra the author mentioned. So I found the original book. And there is the stamp of the Theosophical Library. And Theosophy, we know, was very important in that period. Sukarno was familiar with Theosophy, all the independent circle in Indonesia. So Theosophy was also, I think, instrumental in making the yoga of Patanjali classical, so popularizing the yoga of Patanjali in India and in Bali. Next slide is just the first page of the book in Javanese script. Next slide, yes, this is another text very similar to the Ajisankhya. This is another manual pamphlet of Hinduism, printed in 1973 in Bali by Rishi Ananda Kusuma. it's very much like the Ajisankhya. It's really based on some old texts, in fact, the Vrihaspati Tattva, but Ananda Kusuma also deviates from the Vrihaspati Tattva in that it prefers the Pātañjala Yoga, not the sixfold yoga. So again, we have two modern authors and the author of the Dharma Patanjala, so one pre-modern text, choosing to adopt Patanjali. Next slide. Yeah, this is just, in fact, about the Rishi Yajna and Sankhya by Ananda Kusuma. So he also mentions some book by Swami Shivananda, so one prominent Hindu yogin and reformer in the early 20th century. So he really takes Shivananda's Hatha Yoga plus Ashtanga Yoga by Patanjali. Next slide. So just to synthesize what happened, you have again two different traditions of yoga, Shadanga and Ashtanga, sixfold and eightfold. You have a lot of texts from Java which are Shaiva and Tantric, and they all have sixfold yoga, so not asana based. Postures are not really important there. On the other hand, you have only one text, the Dharma Patanjala, also old, we don't know how old, but old, which uses the Ashtanga, so the eightfold yoga, for some reason. And then you come to modern Bali, 20th century Bali. You have this tradition, Hindu tradition, which has survived of sixfold yoga. But then you also have two prominent authors, who used eightfold yoga of Patanjali also. So kind of similar phenomenon. They all, 90%, these are really Shaiva texts. So these are texts which continue the Shaiva and the Tantric tradition. But 10%, they deviate, especially with respect to yoga. Why? Well, we don't really know, but perhaps I suspect because Patanjali, so the yoga of Patanjali, was becoming more and more popular. It was perceived as classic, as really the standard form of yoga. After the 12th, 13th century already started, and especially in the 19th and 20th century India, during the reform of Hinduism, Patanjali really became the authority in terms of yoga, whereas before Patanjali perhaps was indeed not representing the majority. In fact, the majority was in all likelihood represented by this very vast and mainstream corpus of Tantra and Shaiva texts, which knew a different kind of yoga. But somehow certain historical developments ended in Patanjali being chosen as the kind of manual for yoga, and the situation is the situation that we know today. So Patanjali is translated into many different languages and sold in many libraries, books based on Patanjali or translations of Patanjali, because the text is really perceived as the Bible of yoga, of modern yoga. And so I thought it was interesting today to present this dynamics, the yoga, the textual knowledge of yoga in Indonesia, also in the light of similar dynamics that happened in India itself and in the contemporary period. Next slide, that will be the last slide. So just to conclude, we have seen that there were many different meanings of yoga, different kinds, but also meanings of the word yoga. That the emphasis on posture, on postures, on asanas, yes, it's a modern phenomenon, because nowadays practitioners mostly do yoga as a bodily exercise, not as a meditation exercise. But it was also there in the old period. So Patanjali's was the form of yoga which was more concerned with asana, with postures. And also there are other preparatory practices, for example, in the case of the sixfold yoga plus 3 or the eightfold yoga of Patanjali. Then, on the other hand, the Tantric tradition emphasized the internalized elements of yoga, the visualization, so the meditation, and the element of union with the God, the chosen Ishtadevata, so the chosen God by the practitioner. And that Pātañjala Yoga indeed becomes really classic in the late medieval period, beginning from the 12th century. And that even in the yoga text, in the Patanjala Yoga text, only a handful of postures are mentioned, so only a few asana are mentioned, vis-a-vis a lot, really dozens of asanas mentioned in the Hatha Yoga text, so in other traditions of text which are influenced by Patanjali, but also by different streams of Hindu thought and practice. So it's, again, the situation is complex, and nowadays, as I'm speaking, a very exciting research is being done on these dynamics, on the historical dynamics, to try to unravel the issue as to whether the postures are really old, or so this is an old tradition, or is rather a modern construct. So there's very interesting research is being done. And so, yeah, in Indonesia is very, I think, important in yoga, for yoga studies, contemporary yoga studies, because we have attestations of both traditions, and indeed, we by studying this text, I believe we can also get insight on the history of yoga in India itself. So this is really all what I wanted to present today. I'm sorry if, I mean, I realize this is there's a lot of specific terminology and specific issues, but nonetheless, this is what I do, my perspective, and perhaps you can, well, it might enrich your current knowledge and also perhaps your practice, if you are a yoga practitioner, to be aware of this tradition, especially in Indonesia, which is very little studies. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. So now it's time for questions. If you have